The Mortain counterattack, August 7th to 12th. If you haven't fought the Germans, you don't know what fighting is. Even when they are up against it, they will still find something to throw at you. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Young, DSOMC No. 3. Commando, Normandy, 1944. To explain the next major development in the battle, we have to go back to August 7th, the day the Germans launched their armoured counterattack at Mortain. With this attack and its eventual defeat, the Battle of Normandy entered its penultimate stage. This being so, it is again necessary to visualise what was happening across the Normandy battlefield in early August, when all the Allied armies were engaged in squeezing the German defenders out of position and contributing in their various ways to the final outcome of the Normandy campaign. Starting in the west, the US Third Army had one corps, the 8th, heading into Brittany and the port of Brest. The rest of Third Army were heading south towards the Loire, intending to curve their right flank round between First Army and that river, form a front and head east, north of the Loire, past Laval and Le Mans, heading on a broad front towards the Seine. Progress here in the open country north of the river would be rapid, for there was little opposition from the Germans and no established defence lines. Then came the US First Army, now under Courtney Hodges, completing its move to the base of the Cotentin and pivoting there to head east towards the Seine, on a line Avranches-Mortain-Domfront. By early August, the First Army line was virtually perpendicular, north to south, from Carentan through Villedieu-le-Poil to the main Fougères-Mayenne road, which formed the boundary with Third Army. Pushing east against fragmented but sometimes stout opposition, the First Army front lined up with that of the British Second Army just east of Vire. This town lay in the First Army zone, and the Second Army front ran northeast from Vire to take in Montpinçon, Thury-Harcourt, and curving east of Caen, reached the sea east of the Orne at Ouistreham. The country to the east of the Orne, south along the axis of the Caen-Falaise road, was now the territory of the Canadian First Army. All these armies were pressing to the south and east, bearing round to force the Germans back to the Seine. The total effect was to put immense pressure on the forces of Second Army and Eberbach's 5th Panzer Army, the former Panzer Group West between the Vire and the Orne. With the British and Canadians grinding down from the north and 2 American armies pushing from the west, the German position in Normandy was serious and unsustainable. By any rational military appraisal, only a rapid retreat to some defensive line west of the Seine, or on the Seine, or east of the Seine, could save them from a crushing defeat. By the first days of August, the German position in Normandy was crumbling, and simple military logic should have compelled the German commanders to accept that fact and pull their forces out of the trap that was closing round them. This von Kluge and his commanders might well have done, but Adolf Hitler thought otherwise. On his maps, the greatest threat to the German hold on Normandy now was the American thrust east from the Cotentin and south into Brittany and towards the Loire. If these could be held, thought the Führer, the German position in Normandy could be sustained until his V-weapons landing on London forced the Allies to the conference table. This view was held by no one else at OKW or OB West, but in the aftermath of the July plot, no one on the General Staff was willing to argue the point. Therefore, on August 2nd, Hitler ordered von Kluge to muster his tank forces and carry out a major push against the Americans, with the aim of breaking through their lines, separating the 2 American armies on the line Mortain-Avranches, and pressing on across the Cotentin to the Atlantic coast. The aims of this attack were to cut the American forces in 2 and bar any further American progress to the east. To do this, it would be necessary to collect the panzer divisions on the British-Canadian front and send them west. This was exactly where General Montgomery now wanted the German armour to go. The further west the German tanks were when the German front collapsed, the more German panzer units would be caught in the subsequent pocket. Tactics had changed because the nature of the battle had changed. It had been static, now it was fluid. But the main strategy, to write down the German forces as ordered for Goodwood and Totalize, remained intact. On the night of August 2nd to 3rd, von Kluge received a visit from General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff. General Warlimont had come to explain the Führer's plan in detail, and the details left von Kluge in despair. At a meeting on August 3rd, General Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, and Sepp Dietrich, commanding the ISS Panzer Corps, added their objections. Dietrich pointing out that if the SS divisions were pulled out from south of Caen, the British and Canadians would attack there and break through. Warlimont pointed out that the SS divisions were not in their proper place south of Caen, where they were being used in a static defensive role and should be sent west to halt the Americans. Eberbach rebutted this argument by pointing out that while infantry divisions were being brought onto the Caen front, panzer divisions would still be needed in the rear to support them. None of this made any difference. Whatever the generals on the spot thought of Hitler's scheme, and they thought it absurd, the Führer wanted an attack towards Avranches, and the generals in the field were obliged to make one. On August 3rd, while these meetings with Warlimont were in progress, von Kluge told General Adolf Kuntzen of the 81st Corps that the Mortain counterattack would not fundamentally alter the current situation. An Allied victory in Normandy was now inevitable. As far as von Kluge was concerned, the only advantage of counterattacking towards Avranches was that the attack would probably halt the US advance for a while and give him time to withdraw his forces from Normandy to a new defence line. This hope was predicated on another hope, that OB West would actually be permitted to organise such a defence line further north, or that OKW already had this matter in hand, which was not the case, or that the Allied air forces would not savage the panzers both during the attack and the subsequent withdrawal. Nor was von Kluge at all happy with the state of the troops available for this counterattack. Every unit in 7th Army was either tired out or already engaged, or written down to a skeleton size. The main unit tasked for this Mortain attack was the 67th Panzer Corps, consisting of the 2nd Panzer, the 2nd SS Panzer, the 1st SS Panzer, the 116th Panzer, all reinforced with units from other panzer divisions, plus the remnants of Panzer Lehr, a force which von Kluge knew was neither strong enough or fresh enough for an all-out attack. These divisions could only muster about 120 tanks of various marks, although this was boosted to 190 by the time of the attack. The only fresh troops available to reinforce this Panzer Corps would have to come from Adolf Kutzen's 81st Corps, the 9th Panzer Division, which was currently at Alençon, south of Falaise, and the 708th Infantry Division, which was en route from the south of France. There was also some disagreement on where this force might be directed. Von Kluge wanted 9 panzer to thrust at Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët. General Hauser of 7th Army wanted to send it to Mayenne. Neither course of action was possible, for it soon became apparent that these fresh divisions would not arrive in time to take part in the Mortain attack. It should be added that this diversion of tank strength still left 9 SS Panzer, 10 SS Panzer, and 12 SS Panzer facing the British and Canadians south of Caen. They too had been written down, but, as related in the previous chapter, were still capable of a formidable resistance. Lacking enough troops or tanks, von Kluge decided that the plan of attack must be altered. Instead of attacking through the country north of Mortain, between that town and the River Seine, he thought that the attack should head southwest, directly through Mortain. It took some time and not a little pressure from the 7th Army staff to convince von Kluge that an attack on a northern axis, towards Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët, between Mortain and the River Seine, would be a much better bet, being both the most direct route to Avranches and one which kept the German forces on higher ground. Final plans were then drawn up to implement this plan, but the OB West staff were interrupted late on August 6th by a further call from Adolf Hitler. On the face of it, the Führer's call brought good news. Hitler wanted a report on von Kluge's intentions and preparations, but informed the OB West Army Group B commander that he was releasing no less than 60 Panther tanks, 80 Mark IV tanks, and all the armoured cars held in the reserve east of Paris for the Mortain attack, a fairly massive increase to 7th Army's hitting power. This good news had just been digested when OB West received another call from Hitler's Chief of Staff, General Oberst Alfred Jodl. The Führer had been mulling over 7th Army's plans and wanted some changes made. This call came in less than 24 hours before the Morton attack was due to go in, and the Führer's changes were radical. The first change was that the attack was not to be led by General Funk of the 67th Panzer Corps, but by General Eberbach, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, who was at present engaged against the British and Canadians. Further exchanges on this point revealed that von Kluge and the Führer were not thinking on the same lines at all. Von Kluge was now on the point of launching an attack as ordered by the Führer towards Avranches, with the aim of stabilizing the German line and cutting the US armies in two. The Führer now wanted a much larger attack commanded by Eberbach and consisting of every panzer unit in 7th Army. This was a problem because, clearly, while von Kluge's plans were almost complete, Hitler's plans were just being formulated thus. Chaos loomed. Von Kluge's reaction to this order is not recorded, but it must have brought him close to despair. First of all, this command totally ignored the situation now developing on his southern flank, around the city of Le Mans. Patton's army had taken Laval and were now heading for the big German supply bases at Le Mans and Alençon. Delay now in taking some action to halt this advance was not an option. The northern front, where the British were pressing forward relentlessly towards Montpinçon, was liable to collapse at any time. Finally, there was the overriding fact that unless the attack towards Avranches was made soon, all surprise would be lost and the outcome disastrous. Von Kluge had been informed by a German intelligence agency that the Allies already suspected he was forming up his troops for a counterattack, another Allied bonus provided by the Enigma codebreakers of Bletchley Park, and all in all, he doubted if his troops could hold their lines for much longer anywhere. If this fresh attack did not go in soon, it could not be mounted at all. This being so, he contacted Hitler and made a heartfelt and personal appeal that the Mortain attack should go ahead, as planned and as soon as possible. Hitler could usually be persuaded by the promise of an attack. His constant complaint was that his field commanders were too cautious and not attacking often enough, but he still felt that the Mortain attack lacked weight. Even so, he permitted von Kluge to proceed, but added that after the 67th Corps reached Avranches, Eberbach was to take over from Hauser and swing the attack northeast, into the right flank of the US First Army. Thereby the Führer hoped disrupting and perhaps even halting the US breakout. This Führer instruction concluded, "The C&C West has a unique opportunity, which will never return, to drive into an extremely exposed enemy area and thereby to change the situation completely." Seen in the context of the German position at that time, this final comment on changing the situation completely indicates the full extent of Hitler's dream world. The Mortain attack was seen at OKW as the long-overdue stroke against the invader, one that would divide the First Army from the Third Army at Avranches and split the American forces in two. After that, the German panzers would turn north and east and drive the Americans into the sea. What the Allied air forces and the rest of the US First and Third Armies would do to Eberbach's forces during this attack, and what the British and Canadian armies would be doing to the enemy lines of communication and those enemy forces on their southern front at Falaise at this time, had not been factored into the Führer's calculations at all. Von Kluge's field commanders were rather more realistic. General Hauser felt that his forces could get to Avranches probably. After that, it would be more difficult, but if he could hold that place and keep the First and Third Armies apart and stop the retreat, Hauser believed he would be doing well, as indeed he would. Further ambitions would have to wait on the outcome of the next day's attack. And so, with Avranches as the objective, the Mortain counterattack went in shortly after midnight on August 6th to 7th. It was made without a prior bombardment and achieved a certain amount of surprise. The leading element in the Mortain force would be 3 panzer divisions, moving in line abreast. On the right wing was 116 Panzer Division, tasked to strike along the north bank of the River Seine and head for Chéronce. In the centre was 2nd Panzer, reinforced for this attack by 2 tank brigades, one each from 1st SS Panzer and 116 Panzer. This unit was to strike along the south bank of the Seine, using the Saint-Barthélemy-Refuvay road as its main axis of advance. Finally, on the left, surged 2 SS Panzer, tasked to sweep forward on either side of Mortain, and reinforced for the purpose by all that was left of 17 SS Panzer Grenadier Division, now reduced to brigade strength. This first wave would be followed by 2 tank brigades of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which were to surge forward through the breach created by the leading divisions and press on to enter Avranches and reach the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, a strong reconnaissance battalion, all that was left of the once mighty Panzer Lehr, would cover the south flank, and the 81st Corps was to remain alert on their southern flank and block any thrust by Patton's Third Army towards the vital supply bases at Alençon. As plans went, it sounded workable. This force of 4 reinforced panzer divisions looked formidable on paper, but it actually amounted to fewer than 200 tanks. To give just one example, one SS Panzer had 43 Panthers instead of the 67 it should have had at full establishment, and only 55 Mark IVs instead of 103. The striking force had also been rapidly assembled. Some of the units had been engaged by the tactical air forces when making their way to the assembly area, and others had been held up in traffic jams on the narrow Normandy roads. All this caused delay. The attack should have been launched at 10 p.m. on August 6th, but it was found necessary to put H-hour back to 11:59 p.m. that day, because the exploiting force from 1 SS Panzer had been delayed by airstrikes and traffic congestion on the narrow roads and was still 6 miles from its start line at H-hour. Neither had 1 SS Panzer sent the promised armoured battalion to reinforce 2nd Panzer in the first line. Nor had the 116th Panzer Division and the 67th Corps commander, General Funk, therefore wanted the commander of 116th Panzer, Generalleutnant Graf von Schwerin, sacked forthwith. Hauser declined to do that, but he sanctioned a 2-hour delay in order that 1 SS Panzer could catch up. When all were finally ready and in position, the panzers rolled forward. The available evidence suggests that this attack caught 7th Corps by surprise. There was no opening artillery bombardment to alert them, and 2 SS Panzer quickly outflanked Mortain, then captured the town and took the high ground towards Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët against no significant American opposition. By noon on August 7th, 2 SS Panzer had taken up positions between Mortain and Saint-Hilaire and was protecting the southern flank of the attack. The only force in the way was the 2nd Battalion of 120th Infantry from the 30th Infantry Division, which occupied Hill 317, Côte 314, just east of Mortain, a position which overlooked the low country to the east and provided good observation for the American forward observers. From that commanding height, the American infantry were able to call down artillery fire on 2 SS Panzer and bring it to a halt. The key to any advance or defence on this part of the front was the small town of Mortain, population in 1944, 1,600. Mortain lies at the southern end of the Suisse Normande and stretches along a ridge just below a steep hill listed on the US military maps as Hill 317. The 1st Infantry Division had entered Mortain on August 3rd and occupied Hill 317, but by August 7th the 1st Infantry had moved to Mayenne. Mortain and the hill above it were now held by elements of the 30th Infantry Division. Like the rest of 1st Army, the 30th Division was expecting resistance to its advance east, but not a strong counterattack by armoured formations. The division had been preparing to move east from Mortain on August 7th and attack Barenton on the following day when a warning order arrived from 7th Corps, advising that a counterattack might come in during the next 12 hours. General Hobbs of the 30th Division was therefore instructed to hold his ground and reinforce the troops on Hill 317, the key to the entire Mortain position. The first German attack came against the positions of 1st Infantry Division near Barenton at around 4:30 a.m. on August 7th, when 6 tanks and an infantry battalion from 2nd SS Panzer came surging out of the night. The forward elements of the 1st Infantry fell back, but the Germans did not follow up. The division had only sporadic contact with the enemy for the rest of the day, and spent it protecting the routes into Mayenne. The attack against the 30th Division at Mortain was far stronger. The 2nd SS Panzer Division came into the town with tanks and infantry soon after midnight on the 6th to 7th, and rapidly overran the positions held by the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment in the centre of Mortagne, isolating the 1st Battalion of the 120th on Hill 317. One of the 2nd Battalion companies held its position on the outskirts of Mortagne and is credited with knocking out around 40 German vehicles, including tanks, over the next couple of days. Other elements of the 30th Division were also under attack. The headquarters of the 117th Infantry was surrounded by German troops, and enemy troops and tanks were already through the town, surging west towards Avranches. In spite of all this activity, the 30th Division did not report the German attack to 7th Corps headquarters for another 3 hours, until 3:15 a.m. on August 7th. Fortunately, the 4th Infantry Division, in 7th Corps Reserve when the action opened, joined the fray early on. Their guns put down heavy artillery concentrations on the German forces along the north bank of the River Say, while the rest of the division stood to resist any attack on their position. For a few hours, everything depended on Hobbs's 30th Division, but more and more American divisions came into the fight as the day wore on, and the American position at and around Mortagne gradually grew stronger. Fighting in the 30th Division sector went on for most of the day, a mixture of strong attacks by German tanks and infantry and infiltration of the American position by snipers and fighting patrols. The 30th stood its ground and fought back steadily. "There were many heroes today, both living and dead," reported one battalion commander, and by nightfall on August 7th, General Hobbs could report proudly that although the division had taken over 600 casualties that day, their positions had been held. Nor was the German attack making much progress elsewhere. In the centre of the attack, 2nd Panzer got off to a slow start along the River Say and again surprised the Americans. The right-hand column of tanks therefore made good progress to Le Mesnil-Adelais before encountering any resistance, but when it ran into artillery fire 3 miles west of Le Mesnil-Adelais, the column stopped. The left-hand column of 2nd Panzer had not moved off at midnight, but stayed on its start line until the Panzer battalion promised by 1st SS joined at daylight. The left-hand column then made good progress to the outskirts of Juvigny, before it was stopped by American resistance and daylight, which, with the arrival overhead of RAF Typhoons, made further progress impossible. The sum total was that no element of the 2nd Panzer reached even its first objective on August 7th. In mid-morning that day, General Funk sent in one SS Panzer in a bid to take Juvigny and get the attack moving again, but while the advance was stalled, the tanks were very vulnerable to air attack. Once the morning mist had cleared at around 11 a.m., the Jabos were soon at work, swooping down to strafe and rocket the panzer columns, causing havoc in the soft-skinned transports and obliging the panzer grenadiers to take to the fields. These German columns were also coming under fire from American artillery on either flank, while the north flank of the German attack along the River Say, which should have been covered by 116 Panzer, was actually wide open. General von Schwerin, the commander of 116 Panzer Division, had failed to advance at all. By noon on August 7th, General Hausser was probably wishing that he had listened to General Funk and sacked the 116 Panzer commander on the previous night. It now transpired that, fearing American attacks would encircle his position if he moved towards Chéronce, and convinced that the 84th Division, which was due to cover his rear, would be unable to hold out against increasing American pressure, von Schwerin had kept the attack order from his subordinate commanders. Von Schwerin therefore elected to disobey all his orders and neither send a tank battalion to 2nd Panzer, nor take part in the Mortagne attack. Such a flagrant breach of orders was virtually unheard of in the German army, or indeed in any army, and at 4 p.m. on August 7th, General Schwerin was relieved of his command. Even so, the damage was done. The 116th Panzer Division finally advanced at 4:30 p.m., but the Americans were now fully alert. The sky was full of Allied aircraft, and the division made no progress. So, instead of a devastating blow by 4 Panzer divisions, the Mortagne attack on August 7th was delivered by just 2 divisions, neither fully up to strength in either tanks or men. Moreover, the German troops, knowing that the Jabos would soon be about once the morning fogs had cleared, abandoned all attempts at forward movement by midday and dug in for protection against air attack. The US official history records British hurricanes and typhoons firing rockets struck awe into the German formations, and the support promised to the Panzer columns by the Luftwaffe failed to appear. Those German pilots who took off from airfields in the Beauce around Chartres were quickly intercepted by Allied fighters, and not a single German aircraft appeared over Normandy to support the Mortain attack. All this was bad enough, but the final blow against the success of this operation was delivered at the end of the afternoon by Adolf Hitler. The Führer had spent the day poring over von Kluge's plan yet again and come to the conclusion that it had a number of flaws. First, von Kluge should have sent one SS Panzer against Saint-Hilaire, not against Mortain. Secondly, he should have waited until the Panzer force was fully assembled before attacking at all. However, the Führer could not see how the second, smashing follow-up blow with the 3 Panzer divisions of Eberbach's 5th Panzer Army, 9 SS, 10 SS and 9 Panzer, could now be resisted. The fact that these divisions were now fully engaged elsewhere, stemming the British or the Canadian Totalize attack south of Caen, did not concern him. The stalling of the first attack was clearly all von Kluge's fault, and the Führer decided he had no option but to take personal charge of the Mortain offensive. His first order was a command to prosecute the attack daringly and recklessly to the sea. He also ordered that, whatever the risk to the German position on the Caen front, 3 Panzer divisions, 9 SS, 10 SS and either 12 SS or 21 Panzer were to be withdrawn from 5th Panzer Army and committed to the Mortain attack in order to bring about the collapse of the Normandy front by a thrust into the deep flank and rear of the enemy facing 7th Army. This was accompanied by further exhortations calling for daring, determination and imagination at all echelons of command. The attack was scheduled for the evening of August 9th. By the evening of August 8th, von Kluge had already decided that such exhortations would not remedy the situation. The Mortain attack had failed, and with American pressure mounting on either flank of the thrust, unless the forward elements were withdrawn quickly, there was every chance that they would be encircled, cut off, and destroyed piecemeal. This view was confirmed by a call from General Eberbach. Eberbach was sure that he would be unable to hold his front at Falaise unless he was quickly reinforced, for the Canadian Totalize attack was now developing. Von Kluge had already diverted the newly arrived 331st Division to the 5th Panzer Army and was mulling over a decision to send units from 7th Army east towards Falaise when the order from Hitler regarding the second Mortain attack arrived at his headquarters. When the Führer's new order was digested, gloom descended across the command centres of Normandy, but unlike General von Schwerin, Günther von Kluge always obeyed orders. He duly telephoned Eberbach and informed him that not only would he not be getting any reinforcements, he would also be losing 3 of his best divisions. There is a touch of madness about this action, for as von Kluge informed Eberbach, "I foresee that the failure of this attack, at Mortain, can lead to the collapse of the entire Normandy front, but the order is so unequivocal that it must be obeyed." Eberbach's response is not recorded, but von Kluge then phoned Hauser to tell him that 10 SS and 12 SS would be joining his command the following day and were to be committed to renewing the stalled attack on Avranches on August 9th. Hauser admitted the failure of the attack so far, a fact he attributed to Allied air power, the non-participation of 116 Panzer on the first day, and steadily growing American resistance. This is a fair summation, and apart from the fact that 116 Panzer were now in the field, if not actually moving much, it was not likely that the situation would improve in the near future. Hauser also doubted if even a reinforced thrust on Avranches could now succeed, but orders were orders for this SS general, and he prepared to carry them out. Carrying out a fresh attack would not be easy. All surprise had been lost, and General Collins now had 7 divisions, 5 infantry and 2 armoured in position to crush the German salient west of Mortain. The only division still in serious trouble was the 30th, and that was still hanging on and fighting back around Mortain, in spite of the fact that 2 of the division's 9 infantry battalions were absent, one in Barrington, one attached to the 2nd Armoured Division in Vire, and the division was still absorbing around 800 replacements. General Hobbs was also without any reserve, and General Collins sent him a regiment from the 4th Division in order to provide one. Although the tenacious fighting of the 30th Division on Hill 317 was crucial, the major factor in halting the Mortain attack was air power. Once it got light, the German tanks and guns could not proceed and had to be driven off the roads and into the woods and fields where they were hastily camouflaged. This appears to have limited the subsequent losses, but not prevented them. 10 squadrons of 2nd TAF took to the air over Mortain on August 7th, and of 70 tanks making the initial penetration that morning, less than half were still mobile by the end of the day. By the morning of August 8th, only 25 German tanks were still in action on the Mortain front. Now these forces had to hold on to the ground they had gained, carry on the struggle for Mortain itself, and await the arrival of reinforcements from Eberbach's army. These reinforcements could not move in daylight either, so the attack scheduled for August 9th had to be postponed until August 11th. Eberbach, as directed, took personal command of the divisions sent to Mortain, which were therefore designated Panzergruppe Eberbach, leaving the command of the 5th Panzer Army south of Caen to Generaloberst Sepp Dietrich, previously commander of ISS Panzer Corps. On arriving at 7th Army HQ, Eberbach soon decided that he could not attack on August 11th either, since his force only had 127 tanks, no spares and very little in the way of petrol and ammunition. Moreover, Allied air power clearly dictated that any attack could only take place during the limited hours of midsummer darkness, and before the morning mist lifted, say up to 10 a.m. After that, the day belonged to the Yabos. The snag was that tanks were no good in the dark and needed moonlight to move, and the next full moon was a week away. Eberbach therefore decided that he could not attack before August 20th, a decision that inevitably attracted the wrath of the Führer. There was also another worry. It appeared that the US 15th Corps of Patton's army had stopped heading east and was now heading northeast towards Alençon and those vital German supply depots. If this was linked, as it must surely be, with the Canadian Totalize push on Falaise, then the Allies were obviously trying to put the German divisions at Mortain into a pocket. Von Kluge therefore suggested to the Führer that rather than continue towards Avranches, he should use Eberbach's force to drive back this new thrust from the US 15th Corps. On the following day, August 11th, von Kluge went further. He told Jodl at OKW that in his opinion and in the opinion of all his commanders, the Avranches attack must be called off, not least because 9th Panzer, now engaged near Alençon defending the fuel and ammunition dumps, was in trouble and needed support. Although the Canadian attack had been halted by August 12th, an Allied pincer movement was clearly developing east of Mortain, and the only sensible decision was to pull all the divisions in the Mortain salient back and as quickly as possible. Von Kluge then put these views on paper and sent them to Hitler, wisely including proposals for subsequent action, namely that 7th Army, having withdrawn from Mortain, would assemble a strong force in the area of Carriages, 1 SS, 2nd Panzer, and 116 Panzer, and attack the US 15th Corps south of Alençon, this attack to go in no later than the early hours of August 14th. Hitler gave this suggestion qualified approval. The 7th Army could withdraw from Mortain, but only to reform and attack 15th Corps. That done, they were to try again for Avranches. This was not exactly what von Kluge had hoped for, but full agreement was rarely on the cards with Adolf Hitler. On the night of August 11th, von Kluge began to extricate his divisions from Mortain, and they were never to come back. The Mortain counterattack had now lasted 6 days and achieved virtually nothing. Although it brought a brief halt to the eastward advance of 7th Corps, it did so at great cost. The 30th Infantry Division, the main US force engaged at Mortain, lost some 2,000 men in the 6 days of the offensive, and the 4th Infantry Division lost another 600, but German losses in tanks and men were far higher. When the US troops moved forward from Mortain, they passed the burning wreckage of more than 100 German tanks. Nor had this German thrust restricted American progress elsewhere. 19th Corps had continued to push down from the north and joined up with the 30th Division on August 12th, and 5th Corps had moved south of Vire and was now pushing south and east against diminishing German resistance alongside the British Second Army, which was across the Suisse Normande and heading south and west towards Falaise. All was now ready for a complete encirclement of the German units remaining in Normandy, and the final trap began to close about them at Falaise. Encirclement August 8th to 18th. Better a solid shoulder at Argentan than a broken neck at Falaise. General Omar Bradley, A Soldier's Story. With the ending of the German attack at Mortain, the last phase of the Normandy campaign begins. This would be the advance by all 4 Allied armies on Falaise and Argentan, and the squeezing of the German forces into the Falaise pocket. With so many units involved, moving in different directions at the same time, it is all too easy to lose track of events, and to clarify the picture it will be necessary to go back a few days and pick up the story on August 8th with a telephone call from Bradley to Montgomery. During that call, Bradley suggested that, rather than simply push east, the 2 American armies comprising the US 12th Army Group should also swing north towards Argentan and Falaise, both of which were in the proposed 21st Army Group zone. To avoid collision with the Canadians coming south on Falaise, Bradley added that the US armies should not enter these towns but stop some distance to the south, on the line of the road between Domfront and Say. This move would narrow the gap through which the Germans must retreat towards the Seine, and the gap could be either closed by the Canadians advancing on Falaise and Argentan, or by shell fire and the tactical air forces. This telephone conversation took place while the Germans were still battering at Mortain, and the Canadians had already pushed up to the outskirts of Falaise with Totalize, but the idea was sound. If the British and Canadians continued their advance south and east, and the Americans swung up from the south to meet them, the German armies west of the Orne would be caught between 2 arms of a closing vice. The fact that Bradley rang Montgomery with this suggestion should be noted in view of what happened later. On August 11th, accepting this advice, Montgomery therefore issued a directive that the Americans would head north and east for Alençon, while the British and Canadians would come south to secure Falaise and Argentan. A look at the map on page 350 will be helpful, and we can pick up the story from August 11th, by which time some moves to implement this plan had already taken place. Montgomery's assessment was that the bulk of the German forces in Normandy were now west of a north-south line from Caen to Le Mans, a line running through Falaise, Argentan and Alençon. The aim now was to take those places and encircle the German forces still remaining to the west. General Hodges had already begun to move forces up from Barenton to encircle the German troops at Mortain and establish a line between Barenton and Domfront. Patton's Third Army, reinforced by 2 divisions, one of them armoured, was hooking round to a line through Saze and ready to thrust for Alençon. The task of meeting the Canadians, which was rather more than he had been ordered to do, Patton gave to the US 15th Corps of Third Army, but Monty's directive of August 11th approved of this move. "Obviously," he stated, "if we can close the gap completely, we shall have put the enemy in a most awkward predicament." However, according to the August 11th directive, Patton's Third Army were to halt on a line between Saze and Carouges, 12 miles south of Argentan, which would be taken by the Canadians. This would put the German armies in a trap around Falaise, but it would still leave a gap between the 2 Allied armies, the Canadian 1st and the US 3rd. This gap would be covered by both the Allied tactical air forces and the artillery, who therefore had a 20-mile-wide free fire zone. Anything that moved in the gap between Falaise and a line just south of Argentan could be attacked at will and destroyed. If that plan failed to catch the enemy at Falaise-Argentan, they could be pursued east and caught again somewhere west of the Seine. The situation was fluid, everything depended on the events of the next few days, and the actions and reactions of von Kluge and Adolf Hitler, but for the moment Montgomery's directive of August 11th was the one to follow. At this time, the 15th Corps of Patton's Third Army was pressing on across Maine against light opposition. The Corps entered Le Mans on August 8th, and by August 12th it was heading north for those German supply bases at Alençon, progress now delayed by the stiff resistance put up in front of that town by the 9th Panzer. Apart from the 8th Corps, which was still rushing west into Brittany, the rest of Patton's army was pushing east to the north of the Loire, but like the 15th Corps was now gradually swinging northeast, up towards Chartres and the Seine, west of Paris. The 7th Corps of First Army was still held up at Mortagne, but was gradually regaining the initiative as Eberbach's forces pulled back east. Guerreau's 5th Corps and Corlet's 19th Corps had pushed south and were now beyond Vire, butting hard into the crumbling right flank of 7th Army, 5th Corps heading for Tinchebray, and 19th Corps heading for Flers. On the British Second Army front, by August 6th, the 8th Corps had reached or crossed the Vire-Condé road with the hard-charging 11th Armoured Division in the lead. On the 30th Corps front, the 43rd Division had secured Montpinçon, but were still being subjected to counterattacks astride that hill, attacks which aimed to drive them back across the crest. On the left of the 43rd Division, the rest of the 30th Corps were pressing on across the Odon and down the Orne Valley towards Thury-Harcourt and Condé, while 12th Corps had reached Thury-Harcourt and were advancing southeast on the road towards Falaise. The Canadian 2nd Corps were also pressing on towards Falaise down the road from Caen, while the rest of the Canadian First Army was expanding to the east across the River Dives. The word that describes all the Allied tactics at this time, during and after the Mortagne counterattack, is pressure. In a wide circle from south to west to north, all the Allied armies, American, British and Canadian, were exerting pressure on the German armies, pressure that would squeeze the 7th Army and most of the 5th Panzer Army back across the Seine, if they were lucky, or into an Allied pocket west of that river if their luck or their petrol ran out. In his account of the Normandy battle, Montgomery states that his original intention so frequently described in this book was for the right flank of Bradley's 12th Army Group to make a wide sweep south, then come east and hit the Seine between Rouen and Paris, while the British and Canadian armies struck directly northeast from Caen-Falaise and hit the river somewhere between Rouen and the sea, both forces driving the retreating German before them. Circumstances, or rather opportunities, had altered this plan. The Allied armies were no longer trying to drive the German forces swiftly out of Normandy. The aim now was to trap the remains of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army west of the Seine and destroy them, and it is by the success of that aim that the generals would now be judged. The most important task at the moment was for the Canadians to take Falaise, and, said Monty in his directive of the 11th of August, "It is vital that this should be done quickly." Having done that, the Canadians could drive on and take Argentan, 14 miles further south. The subsequent battle for Falaise and the attempt to close the Falaise pocket has become one of the most contentious parts of the entire Normandy campaign, with accusations of failure and the blame for slowness in closing the neck of the Falaise pocket flying about and eventually settling upon Montgomery and the British and Canadian armies. In part, this exercise in recrimination arises because all the Allied armies in Normandy had a share in this final battle around Falaise, and their commanders and national historians have since become anxious to claim full credit for their part in the action and pass the blame for any shortfall on to the rest. An objective review of the evidence would suggest that all the Allied armies and, above all, both Allied air forces played a full part in this last battle of the campaign at Falaise, and any blame or glory can be equally shared. Montgomery's insistence on the need for a quick capture of Falaise is worth noting. Many of the subsequent recriminations rest on the allegation that the British and Canadian advance through Falaise was just too slow or timid, and that the Americans were not permitted to surge up to Falaise and do the work for them. This allegation will be carefully examined in the pages that follow, but no part of this allegation can rest on Montgomery, who was urging his commanders to go all out for Falaise. After the broad picture given above, the progress of events may be picked up in the headquarters of Field Marshal von Kluge, where we can view the developing situation at Morton Falaise from the German side. On the night of August 7th to 8th, at the start of the Morton counterattack, von Kluge was informed that a force of some 600 British and Canadian tanks were pressing out of Caen and heading south for Falaise, the start of Totalize. This move could not have come at a worse time, for the sorely tried commander of Army Group B von Kluge was just about to move 3 Panzer divisions away from 5th Panzer Army and use them, as directed by the Führer, for another push towards Avranches. Circumstances now dictated a change in these orders, and in the event only 10 SS Panzer was moved. The orders from 9th SS Panzer and 12th SS Panzer of ISS Panzer Corps were cancelled, the first to contain the British south of Beni-Bocage, while 12th SS Panzer remained south of Caen to continue their 2-month-long feud with the Canadians. The defences north of Falaise were then further reinforced by the committal of the newly arrived 85th Division and a Panther tank battalion from 9th Panzer. Having further considered the Canadian offensive, the continued British pressure towards Condé, and Patton's threatening moves against Alençon, von Kluge postponed the second thrust towards Avranches, pending further talks with the Führer. Von Kluge was no fool, and he saw no point in pushing his few remaining assets even deeper into the bag. It had already proved necessary to divert units tasked for the attack on Avranches and deploy them to protect the flanks of the Mortagne salient, but von Kluge and Hauser still felt that if the proper arrangements could be made in the shape of reinforcements, fuel, ammunition, supplies and protection for their flanks, and rear a fairly tall order in the current circumstances, this thrust to Avranches could still succeed. This optimistic view was shared by Adolf Hitler, and on August 9th he ordered von Kluge to prepare for a renewal of the attack, but added that a quantity of anti-tank and assault guns should be sent to bolster the defences north of Falaise. In short, the Führer wanted his forces to fight a defensive battle north of Falaise against the British and Canadians and an offensive battle against the Americans west of Mortagne. This still left the matter of Patton's army in Maine, which apparently did not enter the Führer's calculations at all. Matters began to go seriously awry on August 10th, when von Kluge was informed that the US 15th Corps, currently at Le Mans and believed to be driving east, had suddenly changed direction and was now coming north towards Alençon. It took very little time for von Kluge to connect the northern thrust by 15th Corps with the southern thrust by Canadian 2nd Corps. Unlike Hitler, he knew that the scanty forces left to his 81st Corps could not stand for long against a strong American drive, and he had to consider whether it might not be better to cancel the thrust on Avranches and send his panzers south to give 15th Corps a bloody nose as it came north, although this too would drive them deeper into what appeared to be an Allied trap. This was a decision that had to be taken by Adolf Hitler, to whom the question was now addressed. The Führer mulled over the problem again, but eventually agreed that in view of the supply dumps, blunting the 15th Corps drive towards Alençon took priority at least for a while. Von Kluge therefore telephoned Eberbach, and they agreed that the Avranches move was out of the question, at least until the looming possibility of encirclement at Mortagne had been eliminated. The Canadian II Corps had by now been stopped by the deep defences north of Falaise, and this freed Eberbach's Panzergruppe for a brief strike south at 15th Corps, primarily to protect 7th Army's vital supply bases at Alençon, which contained most of the available German supplies of fuel and ammunition. Having given Eberbach his orders, von Kluge then phoned Hitler. The consensus of opinion in Normandy, he told the Führer, was that an attack on Avranches was currently impossible. He then added that to attack the US 15th Corps with any hope of success he would need at least 2 fully equipped panzer divisions. However, if these could be provided, he could attack the 15th Corps on August 13th and hope to have driven it back by August 16th, which still left time, all being well, for Eberbach's promised moonlight strike against Avranches on August 20th. This last comment was probably added to divert the Führer's wrath, for it was becoming increasingly obvious that a renewal of the Avranches attack was simply not on, however the situation developed elsewhere. On August 13th, A further withdrawal to the east proved necessary in order to stave off British pressure from the north, coming down from Condé to Flers. Von Kluge asked permission to withdraw the 7th Army to a line astride Flers, running from there north to Falaise and south to Domfront, plugging the gap between the Suisse normande and the high ground running from Mortagne through Domfront to Bagnols, while sending some armoured units to bolster Panzergruppe Eberbach, the former Avranches strike force, at Argentan. 116 Panzer, or what was left of it, had now arrived at Argentan and taken charge of the remnants of 9th Panzer and other German units in the area. Hitler agreed to these steps in order to reinforce what was now described as the salient west of Flers. Although von Kluge was supposed to be getting reinforcements, the 11th Panzer Division was en route from the south of France and might be expected shortly. The units he had were now very short of tanks, men, ammunition, fuel and sleep. Continuous night operations followed by days under aircraft attack were taking their toll. Besides, the only way to support 9th Panzer on the southern flank was to pull 116 Panzer, 1st SS Panzer and 2nd Panzer out of the line at Mortagne and let the Americans there push east. Weakening the German line north and west of Falaise was just not on, and it was abundantly clear to von Kluge that some hard decisions would have to be made, and made quickly. The most obvious course of action was to abandon the Mortagne position completely and send the forces there against the 15th Corps, thereby stabilising the left or southern flank of 7th Army, while the 5th Panzer Army and Panzer Group Eberbach fended off the British and Canadians coming in from the north and the Americans arriving from the south and west. Von Kluge had seen the developing trap and decided on his priority to keep the gap open and his two armies in being, even if the Allies pushed them across the Seine. Better that than allow the Allies to trap and destroy all the German forces at Falaise. This conclusion had to be referred to Adolf Hitler for his decision, and von Kluge therefore wrapped up the matter in a long report and sent it to Jodl. Hitler's reply came in on the evening of August 11th. To von Kluge's immense relief, the Führer was broadly in agreement with his proposals and sanctioned a withdrawal from Mortagne. The attack on the 15th Corps must be made with the existing forces, as Hitler had decided to keep the promised 11th Panzer Division in the south of France, possibly in anticipation of the forthcoming Allied invasion Operation Dragoon, which took place on August 15th. This painful decision having been taken, the Germans duly began to withdraw from Mortagne on the night of August 11th, and the race to escape the trap at Falaise was on. In Montgomery's August 11th directive, 2nd Army were tasked to cross the Orne and the Suisse normande and move on Falaise. Given the importance of the Alençon supply dumps, whose existence was known from the ultra-decrypts, Monty calculated that the Germans would put more effort into defending Alençon, which occupied a strong defensive position between two areas of high ground, than they would into holding Argentan. Argentan therefore became an objective for the Canadians after taking Falaise. So the final pattern of encirclement emerges. The southern jaw would be the US 15th Corps at Alençon, the northern one the Canadians at Argentan. It was therefore vital, said Monty, that the Canadians took Falaise quickly and then moved on Argentan. Meanwhile, to broaden the southern jaw, the US First Army would turn northeast, between Domfront and Barenton, and head towards Flers. Once again, as Montgomery had pointed out, it was all a matter of time, but there was also the problem that the Allied armies attempting to close the Falaise gap were on a series of collision courses. If the Germans were squeezed against some physical barrier like the River Seine, and could not get across because the Allied air forces and artillery had destroyed the bridges and crossing points and could keep them destroyed, the Germans would be forced either to give in or face annihilation. This had been the case in North Africa in 1943. The German Africa Corps surrendered when it was forced into a pocket at Tunis and had nowhere to go but into the sea. The obstacles the retreating Germans faced at Argentan-Falaise were not physical but human Allied soldiers. If the Allied armies got too close to each other or advanced until their lines met, there was the strong possibility that they would clash. Even if that did not happen, the presence of Allied soldiers and tanks milling about among the German forces would seriously inhibit the actions of the two tactical air forces. The current plan for Allied encirclement would leave a gap of some 15 miles between Falaise-Argentan, where the two wings of the Allied trap would stop. Through this gap, the German army might be expected to stream east to the Seine, and in that zone, spanned by only two escape roads, one to Chambois and Gayce in the Canadian sector, the other towards Dreux in the Third Army sector, the Allied air forces, strategic and tactical, could mount a killing spree of awesome proportions. With this in prospect, the battle for the Falaise pocket began, and with it came confusion. The aims of the northern Canadian jaw are easy to establish, as are those of First Army. The difficulty lies with the US Third Army, specifically 15th Corps, now tasked to head north for Alençon and meet the Canadians somewhere around Argentan. At some point on the way, the 15th Corps objectives seem to change. In the 3 days after August 11th, the British 12th Corps and Canadian 2nd Corps battered their way across the Orne towards Falaise. By August 14th, the 12th Corps was 7 miles from Falaise and the Canadian 2nd Corps 6 miles. The 15th Corps of Third Army had taken Alençon on August 12th and were now moving on Argentan, which the US 5th Armoured Division had been ordered to take, or so it now appears. Exactly when this order was given or by whom is not immediately apparent from either the British or US official histories. The US history clearly states that the Canadians were to drive south from Falaise and take Argentan, and this view is confirmed in the British history. But then, according to the British history, having taken Séez and Alençon on August 12th, the US 5th Armoured Division were ordered north to take Argentan. This order seems to have originated from Patton's HQ on August 8th, when he directed General Haslip of the 15th Corps to proceed to the Carouges-Say line and prepare for a further advance northward. On August 11th, states the US history, on the basis of the further advance inferentially authorized, whatever that means, Haslip established Argentan as the new 15th Corps objective, the 5th Division to head there, the 2nd French Armoured Division of 15th Corps to head for Carouges further south. However, the Canadians still appeared to have Argentan in their zone. This recipe for confusion might have caused chaos if the Canadians had been able to get through Falaise in time to move on Argentan, but they could not do so in face of the opposition they were currently meeting. Also, as it happened, the American forces were not able to take Argentan either. As the 15th Corps moved north from Alençon to Argentan, German opposition began to mount. On August 13th, Patton went even further and ordered Haslip to take the 15th Corps north of Argentan, but Haslip had not yet taken that town and was unable to do so. A patrol from the French 2nd Armoured Division of 15th Corps had entered Argentan on August 12th, but was promptly pushed out by a German counterattack, and when the 5th Armoured Division attempted to get round Argentan and head for Falaise, all efforts to do so failed. According to the US history, German guns, well sighted and skillfully concealed on dominating ground north of Argentan, wrought a surprising amount of damage on the French and American formations. It transpired that elements of the 1st SS and 2nd Panzer had entered Argentan on August 13th to add their strength to the elements of 116 Panzer which were already there. It seems unlikely that 15th Corps could have taken the town, but they were now denied any further chance to do so. On the afternoon of August 13th, Bradley ordered Patton to break off the 15th Corps attack and prepare to move in another direction, and George Patton was furious. Patton had already proceeded more than 15 miles beyond the Carouges-Say's line, laid down to separate the American and Canadian armies in Montgomery's directive of August 11th. He then moved up to Argentan, which his 5th Armoured Division had failed to take, but Bradley's decision to call off the Argentan attack infuriated Patton. Patton's remark or demand that he should be allowed to push north and push the British into the sea for another Dunkirk ignored the fact that the decision to stop his northward push into the 21st Army Group zone was in line with an Allied directive. It was also a very sensible decision in the circumstances and issued by his superior officer, General Omar Bradley. Bradley's memoirs and the British official history make it abundantly clear that this decision was Bradley's. "This decision to stop Patton was mine alone," says Bradley. "Monty had never prohibited, and I never proposed that US forces close the gap from Argentan to Falaise." At the time, Bradley adds, he considered that the German forces would be sluicing back towards the Seine and that 19 German divisions were stampeding to escape the trap. "This being so," adds Bradley, "although Patton might have spun a line across that narrow neck, I doubted his ability to hold it. The enemy could not only have broken through, he might have trampled Patton's position in the rush. I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to the possibility of a broken neck at Falaise." These were sound reasons, and given by the one man in a position to know, but the US history tends to dispute them, arguing that Bradley felt he could not let Patton go to Argentan in the 21st Army sector without the permission of his superior officer, General Montgomery, who did not give it. The fact that Montgomery was not asked to give it is overlooked, and overlooks the point already made that when Bradley had an idea or a suggestion to make to Montgomery, for example the turn north towards Alençon, he never hesitated to make it. Why then should Bradley not make another suggestion now, if he thought it helpful? This argument in the US history is a neat but somewhat obvious attempt to switch the responsibility, or blame, for the failure to close the Argentan-Falaise gap from Bradley to Montgomery. This argument ignores several valid points: that the gap had been set up for cogent military reasons to avoid inter-allied clashes and leave room for the deployment of air power, and that Bradley left that gap open for some other cogent military reasons, including his doubts as to Patton's ability to hold the gap open against German forces heading east. As Bradley said later, "We cannot risk a loose hinge. If the Germans hit us with 3 divisions there, it will make us look foolish, and it would be embarrassing for George. George is used to an attack by a single division. He is well enough buttoned up for that, but he's not used to having 3 or 4 German divisions hit him. He doesn't know what that means yet." Had von Kluge managed to muster more divisions at Alençon, George might have found out. Why it is necessary to question this decision, taken by Bradley, to halt Patton by advancing reasons, Bradley himself never put forward other than to blame Montgomery for stopping Patton in his tracks, remains a mystery. The US history rambles on about this point for 2.5 pages, and eventually concludes that Bradley stopped Patton's advance, and he was right to do so. To do otherwise would have meant sticking Patton's neck out against a German thrust from the west, and the resistance mounted by Panzergruppe Eberbach astride Argentan to the north. Nor were Bradley's fears about inter-allied clashes groundless, as these accounts from Canadian riflemen Les Wager and Tom Robson of C Squadron, 59th Armoured Recce Regiment, 59th Staffordshire Division make clear. Les Wager. Total Eyes was to go in with heavy bomber support, the first time we had seen American bombers on our front, and also the last, as it turned out. Getting through Caen was a nightmare, but we reached our gathering place south of Caen and were on a long slope looking south when the forts started coming in, fleet after fleet of them, each a solid wedge of planes. We watched and cheered as they went over, when suddenly one wedge veered off its southern course and turned west towards Caen. A ripple of consternation went along the slope, and I saw the yellow smoke of friendly identification flares start up. We watched in horror as the whole wedge, as if one plane released its bombs, and watched them fall like elongated sheets of rain, and the centre of Caen boiled up in a low erupting line of dust and debris. Then another wedge veered off its southern course, and then another. 3 in all, I think. Since the main body of our division was running the Caen bottleneck at the time, we had casualties, mainly in divisional headquarters, our general for one, and one company of the 7th Brigade. We cursed the Americans for this mindless follow my leader, for that was what it appeared to be. We cursed the lack of adequate ground-to-air communication, and most of all we just cursed from sheer frustration. And Tom Robson. We made a night move on the 14th or 15th of August to the divisional bridgehead over the Orne in the Grimbosk area. It was obvious that the Germans were pulling out and we were being made ready for a reconnoitring role to make contact again. We lined up to start shortly after first light, the armoured cars in the lead, the carriers following and the assault troop of infantry bringing up the rear. This was the normal formation on main routes, and at the start we entered a house the Germans had recently vacated to find heaps of leaflets they had left for us, describing what the Americans were up to with our wives and womenfolk in England. Rather than feel aggrieved, we thought these leaflets hilarious and kept them as souvenirs. We were moving southeast towards Falaise. It was a blisteringly hot day and absolute hell for me as the Bren gunner, sitting next to the hot engine plates in the carrier. As we entered the village of Saint-Marc-d'Ouilly, the villagers came out to welcome us with glasses of cider and Calvados brandy, but when we reached the far end of the village, we came under a heavy stonk from Nebelwerfers on the high ground to the left. We dismounted to take cover in a very shallow ditch as the infantry of the 1/6th South Staffordshire Regiment came through to the front. It was then that the mortaring stopped and the American thunderbolts appeared. I cannot be sure, but I think there were 2 of them, though it seemed like more. They flew down from the top of the column, straight down the road, with their cannon blazing, wheeled out above the road and came back in again. We flung out yellow identification panels, put up yellow smoke, but it made no difference. We were laid head to toe in the ditch when they flew away, leaving us in chaos. The man in front of me never moved and was pronounced dead, and that American attack cost us 20 casualties, 13 vehicles also lost. The divisional historian records that during another attack by US fighters that day near Grim Bosque, we had a further 22 casualties and lost another 4 vehicles. I can recall at the Troop O group next morning someone dryly asking, "What side will the Americans be fighting on today?" That was the last operation C Squadron carried out, because immediately afterwards the 59th Division was disbanded and the men used as reinforcements to top up other divisions. Clearly, it paid to be wary of aircraft when moving on Falaise. Both the Allied air forces put in attacks on Allied troops, but sticking his neck out, or rather sticking his troops' necks out, was Patton's particular area of expertise. So far in Normandy, Patton had been lucky. His forces had met very little opposition, and even now, as Patton thrust for Argentan, the US history comments, "There was no German force to speak of on the right flank, that is in the Third Army Zone towards the Seine." The situation was very different on Patton's left or northern flank, where the US First Army and the British had to contend with the 7th Army, and the Panzer units of 5th Panzer Army were coming east as fast and hard as their tracks would carry them, not to escape at this time, but to bolster the defences of Argentan and keep the jaws of the trap apart until their forces further west were able to come up. The Germans were not at this time attempting to escape through the Falaise Gap. They were coming back to form a new defence line and keep the gap open. Hence Bradley's legitimate concern, but the Third Army advances had been spectacular so far, and Patton's always simmering ego was about to boil over. He was now looking for a fight, and the German divisions mustering at Argentan would have given him one, but Bradley rightly thought otherwise. The capture of Falaise on August 16th had already deprived the Germans of the road running southeast towards Trun, but they still had the use of the one running northeast, from Argentan to Trun and Vimoutiers, beyond the Argentan-Falaise gap.